Hey there, MRA, my Real Africanists. This is Maria Juve, the Real Africanists, and welcome to my channel, right? I am happy to be here. I am happy to be here because you are here. I am happy to be here because I believe the African ancestors want us to be here. And I am happy to be here because I get to do what I love to do here. And that is to engage with you first and foremost, and to talk and teach about African history, African studies, and the current state of African affairs, right? I get to discuss topics that bring us together, people of African descent, around our common history and our real lifetime experience. So again, welcome to my channel. Happy Black History Month 2023, and let's get to today's topic, right? So today's topic is African identity, okay? And the reason why I chose this topic, African identity, is because of a question that I received on a video that I did earlier in the week. The video was on the subject of Egypt, right? So I talked about the first time that I found out that Egypt was in Africa. I was in the 9th grade and I was 14 years old, right? And so I was telling a story about how surprised and shocked I was and dumbfounded really that I was that Egypt was in Africa. And the reason why I was shocked and dumbfounded was because nobody had ever taught us that, right? And all of the images and narratives that I had heard up to that point, right, Egypt was always taught as if it was a separate place from Africa, even in school, okay? Now, we weren't taught a lot about Africa in school at all, right? But even when they mentioned Africa, I mean, the little bit that they did teach us, right, it was never taught as if it was connected to Egypt in any kind of way, okay? We were always taught that Egypt was this vast and, glorious civilization. And of course, Africa was this quote unquote dark continent that, Black people came from, and how we should be happy that, Europeans came and saved us and civilized us, right? Now, I never believed that at all, right? But that was the narrative that, was put forth and that was taught us, right? So I was talking about that again on the video that I did earlier in the week. And the commenter asked me, why was Black people so obsessed with claiming Egyptian civilization? He gave me a number of reasons why he believed that Egypt was not an African civilization, right? He talked about the artifacts and the sculptures and different busts that were left behind, and which he says guarantees or confirms that Egypt was not an African civilization, that it was more of a Middle Eastern civilization, right? He also went on to say that Egypt was actually located Egypt is actually located in the Middle East and is not on the African continent, okay? So I did respond to him, but I don't think that I did the subject justice, right? So I just wanted to expound on that topic and say a little bit more about that whole thing, about this whole African identity thing, because this wasn't the first time that I've heard that perspective, and I'm quite sure if you are interested in African history or African studies, or even Egyptian history and Egyptian studies, if you want to look at it as two separate cultures, then I'm quite sure you've heard that before as well, right? So let's talk about that a little more, because like I say, I've heard that numerous times, that not only are African people always trying to steal Egyptian history or make claim to Egyptian history, but we're also always trying to take credit for other people's history and contributions to world civilization when they are really not our own, right? Okay, so what I mean by African identity basically is who we are as Black people or people of African descent, and what have we contributed to the world, okay? So let's start off by talking about, let's start off by me posing a question. And my question is, why is it so hard for some people to accept the fact that Egypt is an African country, and more specifically that the ancient Egyptian kingdom was an African kingdom, right? Especially with there being so much evidence to validate the fact that this was an African kingdom, okay? So that's kind of a rhetorical question, because actually I know the answer to the question, right? I know why it's so hard for people to accept that, right? And the reason why is based upon how Africa has been historically portrayed in education and in media, right? I believe that it's not a coincidence, or the way Africa has been portrayed is not happenstance. I believe that has been done on purpose. I believe that it has been done intentionally, right? And I believe that it's still done intentionally to this day, okay? And the people that are responsible, or those who are responsible for that, are people that are held in very high regard, right? These are the people that are trusted to tell the world the real story, right? And those are the scientists, the historians, the educators, right? Anthropologists, archaeologists, all these people who are in position in these different fields, right? And whose perspective and interpretation of Africa is assumed to be the truth, okay? So like I said, on the last video I did, I talked about one of those persons, right? One of those people. And that person was George Reisner, right? George Reisner was an American Egyptologist, right? Who was commissioned during the early 1900s, between 1913 and 1932, by Harvard University and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, to do a series of excavations in Egypt, okay? Or basically in what they considered at that time Upper Nubia and Lower Egypt, okay? And I really don't want you to pay any attention to all of these geographical, what I would call descriptions, geographical terms, right? That labels these countries like I say, Upper Egypt, Upper Nubia, or even East Africa, West Africa, because I really believe that these categories, these geographical categories, were just and are still used just to confuse people, right? Just to divide, another form of bigotry, another way to create hierarchies, or to placate or support these ideas of inferiority and superiority, right? Of one people being better than the other, okay? Because most of the time, especially in Africa, you will find where they are saying, like I say, North Africa, because North Africa has mostly an Arab population now, right? Or sub-Saharan Africa, that type of terminology that's used to divide people into inferior status and superior status, right? Okay, so anyway, George Reisner, doing this excavation, okay, George Reisner excavated over 25,000, right? 25,000 Nubian and Egyptian artifacts, right? Collectively. Or, it may have been solely Nubian artifacts, but I'm not sure about that. But all together, right? He excavated 25,000, and he took over 25,000 artifacts and sculptures and artistic property out of that area doing these excavations, okay? Now, during those excavations, both of these regions or both of these areas were under British colonial rule, okay? So I'm not exactly sure how that worked at that time, but I'm quite sure if both of those areas were under British colonial rule, it makes common sense to believe that there was some kind of economic advantage involved in that, right? And also that these institutions, along with Reisner, had to get permission from the British colonial government in order to conduct these excavations, okay? So it's well known that Reisner was a blatant racist and that he thought very little about black people. He actually despised black and African people, right? And that was based upon his own words, right? And his own reputation, okay? So he never believed that African people were able or wise enough, intelligent enough, or had the know-how to create such a vast and progressive and glorious civilization like Egypt, right? Even about Nubia, he believed that Nubia was just a non-essential society that basically had copied everything that Egypt had produced. But now we know that that is definitely not the truth. And Nubia was actually a mother civilization, was a mother society over Egypt, right? Basically, Egypt looked to Nubia for direction and for guidance, okay? So listen to what the words that George Reisner said about African people at that time, okay? He says, the native Negroid race had never developed either its trade or any industry worthy of mention, and it owed their cultural position to the Egyptian immigrants and to the imported Egyptian civilization, okay? So basically what he was saying is that Africans had nothing to do with Egypt, okay? And that those who came into Africa from the outside, those foreigners, those infiltrators, those invaders, right, who invaded and conquered Egypt, were the ones who created, like I said, this vast civilization and produced everything that was there, okay? So I'm saying, though, if someone has come into your country or your society or civilization, okay, because at that time, well, I guess at that time they were countries, so we'll say countries, right? So if someone comes into your country and takes everything out of your country, all these identifying factors that associate your presence with this country or connects you with this country culturally, right? They take that out and take it to a country thousands of miles away, right, to house it at a museum or inside of educational institutions that most people that look like you on this side of the water had no access to, right, and who still to this day rarely visit these institutions. They have no access to, rarely visit these institutions, so they have no idea, what you have contributed to your society. Even people who grow up in that society today who no longer have access to these cultural identifying factors, right? Even people that visit those areas today, who visit Egypt, who visit Nubia or Sudan, right? They have no idea that these things exist. So how in the world, right, can people know that you play a huge role in creating this civilization, right? Because everything that's there now represents those that invaded your country or came after you, okay? Now, I don't mean everything, but I would say a huge amount, right, of what's left probably represents, or most likely represents, those who came before or after the indigenous people created those civilizations, okay? Even on the Boston Museum's website, right? The description that they have that is connected with this exhibition that they did on Nubian culture, right, is suspect, and is really disingenuous and is false, right? Because let me just say this: I've been to an exhibit on Egypt and an exhibit on Nubia, okay? And they were different exhibits, and they were both nice, right? They were both very interesting exhibits, but there was a noticeable difference, right? And this was not at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This was at the museum in my hometown, right? But many of the artifacts and objects are bought from these museums who actually own them right now, right? They are borrowed from those museums, okay? So in the Egyptian exhibition that I went to first, right, you have all of these colossal statues, all of these busts, all of this grandeur, right? All of these grand artifacts, okay? Which was, like you say, which was spectacular, very nice, right? But when I went to the Nubian exhibit, you have all of these miniature replicas of these kings that came out of the kingdom of Kush. You also have just everyday items, like I saw like a shoe, like a comb, maybe a very nice necklace or something like that, okay? And they were nice as well, right? And they were made of exquisite materials like gold, like silver, like ivory, that kind of thing. But like I said, it was a noticeable difference. And again, I believe that is intentional, although the curators of these exhibits probably will never admit that, right? But I think there's always this subliminal message that, okay, we acknowledge that Nubia was an African civilization, right? And they created they had a progressive society as well, and they created beautiful sculptures and artifacts and all that as well, right? But still, here's this civilization, this Egyptian civilization, which is not an African civilization, right? And they created all of this, right? Look at this and compare it to that, okay? And like I say, most people will probably say, well, that may be a little extreme in the thinking, but what I try to put across is that you really have to understand how deep these people go. And when I say again these people, I mean people that are in positions, right, who benefit in some sick way for keeping this ideology or this philosophy alive pertaining to Black or African inferiority and European or white superiority. I mean, it is rooted in every system, every institution, not only in America, but in Europe and across the world, okay? So, like I say, there's always this subliminal message, because there's still no admission that, from what I know, right, there's no admission that the Egyptian civilization, which was actually the Kemetic civilization, was indeed an African civilization, okay? So let me read a description right quick on the Boston Museum's Fine Art website, okay? It says, from 1913 to 1932, the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition conducted a series of pioneering expeditions in northern Sudan under the direction of archaeologist George A. Reisner. As a result, these excavations over a 20-year period and through the generosity of the Sudanese government, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston possesses the largest and most important collection of Nubian art outside of Khartoum. The collection spans 4 millennia from about 3800 BC to AD 350 and includes masterpieces in different media, from colossal statues in stone to gold and silver vessels and exquisite jewelry, right? So, first of all, they talk about these pioneering expeditions. So basically, these tomb robbers, right? This theft, okay, that was happening in those early colonial years, right? And then they talk about the generosity of the Sudanese government. So how is it that the Sudanese government was so generous when, in fact, during the early 1900s, these countries again were under British colonial rule, okay? So, like I said, I'm not sure how that works, but that is a very disingenuous statement, okay? Now, I don't know if today the Sudanese government is allowing the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to continue to keep or own or retain these artifacts and all of this artistic property that belongs to African people. Now, I don't see why they would, but it may have something to do with the fact, that now even the area that we know as Sudan is divided into northern and southern Sudan, and we know that there is a history of conflict between northern Sudan, which is now considered an Arab nation, and southern Sudan, which is considered an African nation, right? So maybe the Sudanese government may be getting something from the fact, some kind of economic advantage, but again, I'm not sure. But I would say that, again, that's one of the reasons, and that's one of the tactics that has been historically used to disassociate African people with Egyptian civilization and with other indigenous civilizations, right? So again, that is something that you have to be conscious of and look out for, especially if you are interested in African history and Egyptian history, okay? They are one. Egyptian history is just a continuation of African history, okay? And Reisner, that thought pattern was very prevalent among anthropologists, historians, and all of these people during that time, okay? Though that whole narrative that Africans were uncivilized and not intelligent enough, didn't have the know-how to do this and do that, was just a reason, an excuse that these European powers gave to excuse the the inhumane things that they were doing at that time, okay? But the record is clear, okay, that Egypt was an African civilization, and so basically we can put that aside, okay? Now, there's another reason why I don't understand why people can't believe that Africa was at the forefront of building so many different world civilizations, basically on each continent, okay? And the other reason is because it has been proven over and over again, and not only proven, it has been widely accepted that Africa is the birthplace of mankind, the birthplace of modern mankind as well, and that's very important to note as well, okay? There are two theories. There is the monogenetic theory and there is the polygenetic theory, okay? The monogenetic theory is the out of Africa theory, and that theory states that all life began in Africa, right? There is one origin to mankind, okay? This theory is substantiated by tons of evidence that supports the ideology that a series of migrations by modern humankind or Homo sapiens out of Africa started about 300,000 years ago, right? From 300,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago, okay? And that from there, people came up out of Africa, right? Really across the center of Africa in what we call the East African Rift Valley, okay? In the area of Ethiopia, they kind of went across, in the middle to the Central Africa, to West Africa, down to South Africa, up into North Africa, and out and across the Bering Strait and all of that, all of that. Like I say, I'm not a scientist, but that's the basic of it, okay? And so these human beings left out of Africa that way and peopled the whole world, okay? Now, again, that is a widely acceptable theory, right? Most scientists believe that, okay? But of course, there are still a few that do not and never will, and that's okay, right? But then we have that the oldest fossils in the world were also found in Africa, right? And so the oldest fossil record is also in Africa, also in that same area that we talked about, the East African Rift Valley, where most scientists believe that life started, okay? So we have Artie, which is 4.4 million years old, right? We have Lucy, that is about 3.2 million years old, and we also have Kadanumu, which has been dated about 400,000 years before Lucy, right? But all of these fossils, right, have been dated millions and millions of years ago, okay? 2 are women or female and 1 is male, right? And so there's no doubt about that. The more they dig, the more they find out that the oldest fossils are located on the what we call the African continent right now, right, in the area of what we call Ethiopia now, okay? And like I said, this is right in the middle at this East African Rift Valley, okay? And what's ironic to me is that this is only, a little further up in what is called Sudan today, right? And that's just in that area is where the kingdom of Kush, right, is located. And also this civilization of Taseti, which is said to be the first civilization that evolved into the Egyptian civilization that we know, right? Also in this area that was called Taseti, it was referred to as the nome of Taseti. And nome is, or the nome was an Egyptian administrative division, or the seat of government of Egypt, right? And Taseti was the first nome of Egypt, right? So the first organized seat of government in Egyptian society, or the first organized seat of government that was recorded in history, or that we know, okay? So that was Taseti, okay? Also, I'm not sure if you know or familiar with Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, right? Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, some people say Diop, but it's Diop, it's D-I-O-P, right? The D-I is pronounced as J, okay? He's a Senegalese scholar, right? He's a scientist, he's an Egyptologist, he's a linguist, a geneticist, I mean, you name it, he was, right? He was a brilliant man, okay? Dr. Diop created this DNA test, right? And the DNA test determined the amount of melanin in the body, okay? So he used this test to test the levels of melanin in the mummified bodies of Egyptian royalty, or members of the Egyptian royal family, okay? And through this test, he unequivocally proved that the Egyptian, or the Kemites, okay, the royal family, were blacks, right? And he proved that on the basis that the amount of melanin in the body of these mummies could only belong to people of African descent, because other races and nationalities don't have that amount of melanin in their bodies, right? And so along with that, and along with his associate Theophile Obanga, who is also an African, I believe Dr. Obanga is from the Congo, right? And he is a linguist, right? And an Egyptologist. So along with him, and the proof that Dr. Obanga, or the research that Dr. Obanga submitted, right, that ancient Egyptian languages were akin or rooted in ancient African languages, right? Both of those findings combined, again, have allowed scientists to set the issue aside, and they have acknowledged clearly, that Egypt was an African society, okay? And both of these findings, for both Dr. Obanga and Dr. Diop, were presented at the 1970 UNESCO symposium in Cairo, Egypt, okay? So you can look that up and find out more information on that if you're interested in that, okay? So enough about Egypt for now, and we're gonna move on to other parts of the world, okay? So let's move on to China, right? Since we're always talking about, especially now, right, the whole China and Africa thing and how China is taking over Africa, which personally I don't believe. I think that's kind of blown out of proportion. China is just a world power, and China is invested in probably every country all across the world, right? Everything we get is from China. So China is not just taking Africa over. China is the second world power, right? And China has basically taken over the manufacturing and distribution of products all over the world, okay? So China owns probably just as much as in America as it does, in Africa, okay, and in other parts of the world. So, but anyway, for the longest, it was believed that the Chinese originated from what they call the Peking man, and that's Peking, right? And so this idea that the Chinese originated from the Peking man was based on the polygenetic theory. And remember, I mentioned that earlier. And the polygenetic theory basically is founded on the ideology that there was more than one origin of man, right? That life didn't just begin in Africa, that it began in all parts of the world, okay? Again, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, what can I say? He nullified that theory also, right? He has done some astounding research and some very, he has offered some very critical understanding of how life began in Africa. So again, you can go and do more research on that, okay? But almost 20 years ago, there was an international study of some bones that were found, or fossils that were found in China, that confirmed that the Chinese did not originate from the Peking man, right? Actually, the Chinese originated from humans that came from East Africa, right? So here we have this East Africa thing again, okay? And again, I ask you not to pay attention to this whole East Africa, West Africa, and all of that kind of thing. Like I said, that's just a way of confusing people, and also a way of separating people and creating this hierarchy of inferiority and superiority among people, okay? So this study, right, confirmed that Chinese people originated from people that came from East Africa during a migration 100,000 years ago, right? Which nullified the Peking man theory altogether, okay? The Chinese have accepted that, and so has most scientists, okay? So Africa and China has had a very long relationship, and not just China, Asia, period, okay? They have had a long history of contact between the two, a long history of trade, okay? And so I will say, and that may be one of the reasons why some of the Egyptian artifacts and statues and busts do favor or do have Asian features, right? Because these two cultures have been in contact with one another for a long time, right? So I'm definitely not saying that Egyptian culture was completely an African culture, right? We know that there were, like I say, invasions, there were wars, there were conquests, right, at different times, different ethnicity or different, ethnicities ruled Egyptian civilization, okay? So that is a given, and that we will acknowledge. But we will not acknowledge that Africans were not at the foundation of Egyptian civilization, okay? So that's, like I say, another part of the world, okay? So speaking of China, when I was taking a course on China when I was in at the university. Again, I am a historian by trade. Okay, my concentration is in the area of African studies, but I'm also a general historian. So we were watching a film about China, okay? And so there were some really dark-skinned Chinese people on this film, right? I had never seen Chinese people this dark. I mean, their features were different. They had more broader noses, more broader, lips, and just some of them basically looked, like they could have been black people, okay? And I actually asked my professor about that, okay? And I told him, I said, I've never seen Chinese people look like that. Most Chinese people have very keen features, very, light color skin, and that sort of thing, right? And not saying that all black people are or black or dark, dark skin and have broad features. We know that that's not the case either, right? We know that people that live on the African continent and are fully African, they have keen features. Some are tall, some are short. I mean, they come in all different colors, all, range from all colors of the rainbow, okay? So I'm not saying that either, but I was surprised to see that these Chinese people were looking like this because, again, I had never seen Chinese people look like that. And so what he said to me was that I'm not sure, if Chinese people, have African heritage. I don't know about that, but he told me about a city in China now that has a large African population, and that city is Guangzhou, right? And he says it's one of the largest African populations in Asia. But he also said that he believed that the African arrival there, or the African population there, is a more modern culture, right? And that they came here in recent times. He does not believe that there's some type of ancient connection to that population there, right? And so the name of that city is Guangzhou, and that's Guangzhou. So if you want to learn more about that modern city that has this high population of African people, it would be good to do some research, right? And you can talk about some of that in the comments below, because there has been a contentious relationship between Chinese officials and law enforcement officials in that city of Guangzhou. So it, like I say, it's a very interesting history to know, okay? And so still, we're going to stay in Asia a little bit. We talk about the abundance of work that was left behind by Dr. Runoko Rashidi, and we know that Dr. Runoko Rashidi, well, you may not know that, I don't want to take that for granted, but Dr. Rashidi was this amazing anthropologist and historian who traveled all over the world to document the African presence. So wherever black people are in the world, or wherever black people were in the world, Dr. Rashidi traveled there so that he could document historical research about that African presence, right? Dr. Rashidi was also the foremost expert on the ancient African presence in Europe, so not only in Asia, okay? And he meticulously documented that presence, okay? There's books that Dr. Rashidi wrote, and you can find those books on Amazon, or at your local black bookstore if possible. But the thing that differentiated Dr. Runoko Rashidi's research is that he not only documented it in narrative form, he also documented it through imagery, right? Through pictures, right? His pictures and his collection of pictures that documented the African presence throughout Asia and throughout Europe was unparalleled, right? He has an astounding collection of pictures that documented black deities throughout both Asia and Europe, okay? So I don't know, I remember, unfortunately, Dr. Runoko Rashidi passed away last year suddenly, right? Which was a big loss to the African and Pan-African community. So I don't know how accessible Dr. Runoko Rashidi's work is today. Like I said, I know his books are still available, but I know around the time that he passed away, his family said and promised that they would keep his legacy alive and that they would do all that they could to make sure that the public had access to the work that Dr. Rashidi had done, right? So again, Dr. Rashidi, he documented the indigenous African presence in countries like India, and I think, like I say, was he in Japan at one time? I mean, all over the Asian continent, okay? One time, Dr. Rashidi made a comment during one of his lectures saying that at one time, the country of India had in the past been referred to as the second African continent, okay? Or the other Africa. Now, I'll put a link in the description, below, of one of Dr. Rashidi's presentations, and you can take a look at it, and like I say, you can do further research on the African presence in India, okay? Now, we're going to talk about the African presence in the Americas, right? But especially in Mesoamerica, okay? So in 1938, there was a discovery in an area called La Venta, and which is now known as the Olmec world, right? That's OLMEC, okay? Now there's La Venta, there's Tres Zapotes, I believe that's how it's pronounced, and there's Veracruz. So all through this area, which is known as the Olmec area, there was these discoveries made of these large stone heads, right? And these large stone heads were not typical of the type of artifacts or statues that were found in Mesoamerican civilization, okay? They were different, and as a matter of fact, they looked like people of African descent, of black people, okay? So the discovery in La Venta was made by Dr. Matthew Sterling, and Dr. Matthew Sterling was on a expedition trip in partnership with the Smithsonian Institute and National Geographic, right? So there is another amazing historian and educator and scholar, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, right? Dr. Ivan Van Sertima wrote the book They Came Before Columbus, okay? And in this book, he documented the findings of the expedition of Dr. Sterling, okay? According to Dr. Van Sertima's work, Dr. Sterling and the Smithsonian and National Geographic took on this expedition because of a rumor that there was this huge stone head found in 1858 by a Mexican peasant that lived in that area, right? And he found this huge stone head coming up out of the ground, okay? That was one sighting. But then there was a subsequent sighting 14 years before Dr. Sterling did the expedition. There was another sighting by an expedition team from Tulane University of another stone head that was coming up out of the ground, right, in this same area. So Dr. Sterling again and National Geographic and the Smithsonian Institute decided to do an expedition in that area, right? And of course they did. They found many of these huge stone heads, right, that were just as big as these monuments and statues that have been found in Egyptian civilization, right? And also they found the stone material from which they were carved very close by. Basically, the same kind of thing that happened in Egypt, where they don't understand how they were able to move these large statues from place to place. Okay, so Dr. Van Sertima's research connects those two cultures, the Egyptian civilization with this Olmec civilization. Okay, so a lot of, I would say, fair-minded scientists and historians have acknowledged that these stones and even stepped pyramids that were found in that area and other findings prove that there was an African presence in ancient America, right? But of course, again, there's been a lot of pushback on that, right? And a lot of these European scientists and, of course, Mexican educators, historians, scientists also have argued that that was not the case. But Dr. Van Sertima's research, as well as the research done by Matthew Sterling and other anthropologists and archaeologists that have visited that area, they have acknowledged that this Olmec culture was not a complete African culture, but African people were a part of building, or were at the foundation of building this Olmec culture. Okay, when I was doing my research, the images or pictures of some of these heads that Dr. Van Sertima included in his book, right? And I don't know if these were stone heads or terracotta heads, but they are almost identical to the terracotta sculptures that are found in the Nok culture of ancient Nigeria. I mean, they are virtually